You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City. And I'm delighted today to be joined by a special guest. Joining me from Korea is Andre Ibrahimian, a lecturer at George Mason University, Korea. Andre, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I believe you've written for The Diplomat a few times, but I believe I've never had you on the show, and I'm glad I'm rectifying that today. So, as listeners might imagine, Andre being in Korea and Korea being at the top of world headlines recently over a variety of statements, primarily coming out from the North Korean side, we are going to devote this episode to talking a bit about inter-Korean relations, which I believe we haven't done on the show for a while, so it'll be a good time to revisit this topic. And of course, we have a good peg, Andre, which is the 20th anniversary of the first ever inter-Korean summit way back in 2000 between Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, and Kim Dae-jung, South Korean president. And so before we jump into the discussion, though, Andre, I always like to invite my guests to tell our listeners a little bit about who they are, what their research interests are. So who are you and what do you exactly work on?
I am the second Korea watching Andre after Andre Leghov, the 2.0. And I came to the peninsula in the early 2000s, having recently visited Vietnam and seen a country that was divided and visited that DMZ. And then after visiting the DMZ here, I was really, really struck by how this division was allowed to become so permanent and so enduring. And that got me thinking about doing a PhD in international relations, which I ended up doing here in South Korea, actually, focusing on kind of the nexus of media politics and descriptions of North Korea. And then I got involved with Joseon Exchange, which is an NGO that I helped set up in around 2010-11, teaching North Koreans about business and economic policy. So that dragged me really to focus on social and economic change in North Korea for a time.
And how many trips have you done to North Korea?
31 times.
There we go. Okay. I'm pretty sure you're the best traveled person in North Korea that I've ever had on the podcast. So, Yeah. So, Andre, I wanted to ask you a little bit because obviously, no secret for our listeners, but Andre and I have run into each other a few times at Korea watching events here and there, including pre-pandemic in Brussels. But recently I saw on social media, Andre, that you were on a trip to Yeonggyeongdo, which is a name that some listeners might recall from 2010 when it was at the center of a major skirmish, one of the most significant post-Cold War skirmishes between the two Koreas, that involved the North Korean artillery units shelling South Koreans, including killing a few civilians. So tell us a little bit about what you saw there, and I think that's actually a good place to maybe segue into our discussion today. So I'd love to hear about your trip there.
Yeah, I think it's always really valuable to go to these places that are on the borders, even though there's an element of triteness to it, peering across through binoculars at people living their daily lives feel a little bit invasive and cheesy. Nonetheless, I always come away from a visit to the border, whether it's the Chinese side or the South Korean side, really struck by how real and how cut off North Korea is. I think often when we read the headlines and we look at the news, it's like this abstract problem, but there's almost 25 million people living there, very little understanding of how we live, and we have very little understanding of how they live. And on this particular trip, this island Yeonggyeongdo is just a few hundred meters from North Korean islands and just about a dozen or so kilometers from the mainland of the DPRK, and it's very militarized, as you'd expect. So there's these constant reminders that it is a tense area. There's barbed wires and artillery and fortified beaches and all the kinds of things you'd expect to see in a conflict area. That said, it is very quiet. There's only about 2,000 people who live there, and it is very beautiful also. So those things stand in contrast to one another to some extent.
Yeah, and Yeonggyeongdo really brings us to the issue of inter-Korean tensions, which is really the focus of our discussion today. So the past few days have been quite interesting in this regard. I mean, I guess the place to start maybe is with Saturday's statement made by Kim Yo-jong, who we now think is involved with the United Front Department in North Korea, but we don't actually know for sure.
Hmm.
And Kim Yo-jong put out a statement, and she's been putting out a lot of these statements on inter-Korean affairs lately, threatening to completely collapse the inter-Korean liaison office that was established in 2018 when things were highly optimistic on the peninsula. President Moon Jae-in of South Korea, of course, led a major period of rapprochement with North Koreans acquiescing to that and initiating that actually before the Pyeongchang Olympic Games. And I think that's led a lot of people to anticipate some kind of kinetic, to use the military jargon, it's very sanitized jargon, or some kind of actual provocation by the North. And that was again followed up today by a statement similarly threatening steps. This was coming from the Korean People's Army's General Staff, so directly implicating the armed forces. And of course, with the anniversaries, including the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War this month, and the first anniversary of the first ever inter-Korean summit, it's just an evocative time for these tensions to really spike again. So, Andre, I mean, how did we get from where we were in 2018 with the warm inter-Korean summitry, President Moon walking across the military demarcation line, to where we are now with threats again being exchanged?
Yeah, if I guess before we dive into some of the things that have happened in the last 2 years, I do think it's important to note that there's always a lot of guesswork that takes place when we're trying to understand why North Korea is taking some of the actions that it is taking. Um, as Graham Allison put it in The Essence of Decision, an imaginative analyst can construct an account of value maximizing choice for any action taken by a government, especially when that analyst is prepared to ignore information or doesn't have all the facts at hand. So, as we try to analyze North Korea, we never have all the facts at hand. We often really have no idea what the internal drivers of policy decisions are, what the political and bureaucratic wranglings are that drive these foreign policy decisions that they make. So I just want to note that at the very outset, because we'll probably go through a couple of hypotheses. What do we think the North Koreans want? What do we think their strategy is? But at the end of the day, so much is obscured from us in terms of their internal politics that there's always a very strong chance that we're wrong. So I just kind of wanted to note that at the outset before we dive into.
I think that's very responsible epistemic hedging. Gotta disclaim
yeah,
that.
yeah. So overall, I think we can say that what they really, really wanted from the Moon administration is some follow through on the big inter-Korean cooperation projects that he talked about during the summit 2 years ago at Panmunjom between Moon and Kim. At that summit, Moon Jae-in handed Kim Jong-un a USB that had almost certainly no viruses on it. What it definitely did have was plans for development of North Korea in cooperation with the South. That was supposed to be the big inducement. But one thing that the Moon administration has been very careful not to do is to annoy the United States by pushing the boundaries on sanctions. So they very carefully stayed on side of the US and international sanctions regime. And this has frustrated the North Koreans. Pyongyang wants to see Seoul push the boundaries a little bit more. I think that's sort of the fundamental dynamic at play right now.
I think that's a really good summation. And so we're not going to have time to go through every single thing that's happened in the last 2 years, of course, but I think you've done a terrific job of laying out kind of the starting point, right? And so let me bring up just a recent event that I think, again, might be playing a role here, given all the epistemic hedging and disclaimers, of course. So April, we had midterm elections in South Korea. President Moon looking quite dominant now politically, and that happens to coincide with now this subsequent increase in inter-Korean tensions coming from the North Korean side. So maybe we can do a little bit of hypothesis testing and just talk through some of the things that might be driving things here. So one of the theories is that this is an attempt by the North Koreans to push the envelope, or at least have Seoul push the envelope a little bit, given that President Moon does have the kind of political space that he now enjoys. What do you think of that?
Hmm. Well, that is possible, but why, in that case, would you take such an aggressive approach? One that threatens to undermine the process of engagement or even the ethos of engagement, certainly in the eyes of the international community, right? So if you, as Pyongyang, are asking Moon to say to the United States, listen, we're going to go out on our own, you're not going to like it, but this is what we want to try right now. Why would you make these demands on the balloon launches, the leaflet launches that we saw Kim Yo Jong make last week, and then force, or at least push, the South Koreans into complying in a way that I think really it caused some distress in the international community? Foreign observers definitely um, took a disliking, I think it's fair to say, to
Right.
how quickly the Moon administration did what North Korea wanted on the leaflets. So, why not try a more cooperative approach? That's what I would ask for when faced with that hypothesis.
Yeah, and so we should talk a bit about the leaflet issue, especially for listeners that might not have been following the lead up to the ongoing tensions. I mean, so the leaflet issue is the proximal cause of the ongoing bout of inter-Korean tension. It's been cited in Kim Yo Jong's statements as the reason that the North Koreans are looking to take the actions that they've threatened. And I think there's a degree, I have no reason to doubt that it's not genuine. I mean, in August 2015, for example, the landmine incident between the two Koreas was precipitated by loudspeaker propaganda broadcast by the South Korean side. So the North Koreans are clearly quite sensitive to these kinds of incidents. But to interrogate that a little bit further, I mean, if you are dealing with a government or an administration like the Moon administration, that's really done, as you said, while remaining on side of international sanctions and of the United States, tried to do almost everything it can within those bounds to foster inter-Korean cooperation, and you're looking to create a sense of urgency if you're North Korea. Maybe that's why you are pushing the envelope a little bit, and deciding that if honey doesn't catch flies, then maybe you can try a little bit of vinegar. Of course,
Yeah,
maybe you're not going to get the
yeah.
results you want, but I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here, but I'm curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems possible. It seems probable even to me that previous talks between North and South Korea have come on the back of a crisis, right? And so you have to amplify things in order to create the justification for, say, high-level negotiations that politically are not justified unless something serious is taking place. So I would guess that that's what the North Koreans are looking to do right now. That said, it seems so manufactured from our perspective, right? Particularly the way last week Kim Yo Jong said the leaflets, disgusting affront to our the supreme dignity of our leadership, and some insults about defectors, and then the next day Seoul moves into action and starts taking steps to
Right.
ban the sending of leaflets. And then a few days later, Pyongyang is still making statements about the leaflets as if none of that had taken place in South Korea. So that to me made it look as if there was some kind of script or playbook that they were following that no longer matched the reality on the ground. Because basically now sending these propaganda leaflets from South to North Korea is banned. That's a development that's happened in the past week, and Seoul is using a couple of different pretexts. One is maritime pollution law, and another aviation law that they're using to say that you can no longer send these leaflets northward. So, there's also a degree of speculation that the North Koreans don't want a crisis with the U.S. and particularly with China and Russia. at the moment to spark talks. So an ICBM or certainly a nuke test
Yeah.
would create too much stress for them at the moment. So then the logical choice is to provoke some kind of issue with South Koreans that's a little more localized and a little more contained. But again, that's where we start wandering into speculation, I think.
Yeah, no, and speaking of wandering into speculation, I think the most speculative of the explanatory hypotheses is ones pertaining to Kim Yo Jong herself. Of course, she's been a topic of fascination ever since she first, I believe, was seen lingering behind that pillar all those years ago while her brother gave a speech, and now she's delivering grand pronouncements on behalf. And she specifically invoked that she had the authorization of the supreme leadership in her messaging. And one of the ideas that's been floated is that this is an attempt, like perhaps the Cheonan sinking and Yeonpyeong-do were in 2010, to set up for Kim Jong-un's legitimacy as a military commander, that this is an attempt to do the same for his sister. And of course, his sister was unprecedentedly seen last year attending missile tests alongside Kim Jong-un. And at the time, I sort of had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that this did not bode well. And of course, I think this is totally speculative. I mean, we don't have anything to really support that this is what's happening inside. And it is intriguing, though, to ponder.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the reason I tried to put that little pin in the beginning, that the caveat at the beginning, is because to me that makes a ton of sense. You have her being very present during the period of rapprochement in 2018. She was in the Blue House. Kim Il-sung's granddaughter in the presidential house in South Korea. Extremely dramatic imagery connected to reconciliation and dialogue, and so she was part of that. Now, if they're setting her up to be in the leadership for the long term, they have an opportunity to put her out front of a period of tensions and projecting toughness against their old enemy in South Korea. And so that makes a ton of sense to me. More than the idea that they're trying to create a mini crisis to get concessions, or any of the other sort of strategic hypotheses that we might run through. But we don't know. And so I think it's always important to emphasize how little we know as we guess what is going on with elite politics in North Korea.
Yep, and we're having this conversation just a couple months after the entire world went haywire with rumors about Kim Jong-un's health. So it's certainly something that I think fascinates people, right? I mean, understanding how the leadership dynamics here play out. And I think Kim Yo Jong in particular, I think, has been a figure that's really drawn a lot of curiosity in South Korea and the United States. Just this idea of her being, I think, one of the most prominent, first of all, young females that we've seen in North Korea take the kind of leadership role that she has. And as you noted, I think her being the first descendant of the Paektu bloodline to go south of the demilitarized zone since the end of the Korean War, I think, set her up to play an important role in the ongoing events. But again, there's a lot that's misunderstood.
Yeah, and there was considerable debate amongst my friends and colleagues about the relative value of her being part of the Paektu bloodline, that Kim family, versus being a young female. How do those stack up against each other in terms of inserting her into the leadership group in North Korea? It's, again, an open question.
Right. Yeah. I think Anna Fifield in her book on Kim Jong-un, I think, talks a bit about that, and basically, I think, concludes that her gender is a large liability in building credibility with military graybeards, especially.
I mean, it is. But then, of course, Kim Jong-il's youth and military inexperience, and then, of course, Kim Jong-un's extreme youth when he came to power should have been liabilities too. So, it's worth noting that this is a country that does tend to surprise. They pull things off that by all rights they shouldn't be able to.
Yeah. All right. So zooming out a little bit, we had another anniversary last week, a little bit less notable, I guess, in some ways. But we had the second anniversary of the June 12th, 2018 Singapore summit. I'm being a little glib. I mean,
Mm,
okay, first ever meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader.
hmm
And North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Song-kwon put out a rather acerbic statement on what had
right.
been done since then and how the North Koreans viewed the United States upholding of its commitments as per the Singapore Declaration. I don't want to talk too much about the U.S. North Korea situation right now because I do want to focus on inter-Korean relations. But I mean,
hmm
is there one of the hypotheses we haven't really talked about is a lot of, I think, Korea analysis by Americans tends to over center the role of the United States on the peninsula. But
hmm
at the risk of doing that, I mean, let me ask you: is any of what's happening right now in a way either about the United States, or is it an attempt to again try to catalyze the South Korean leadership to talk to the United States in a way that might benefit North Korea?
Yeah, I think you alluded to it before, or we did. This could in part be about trying to create a wedge between South Korea and the United States, and probing to see if Seoul is willing to make a bit more of a break with the U.S. During a time when, again, as you noted, Moon Jae-in's party has a supermajority in Parliament, and while the U.S. is grappling with the overlapping now crises of COVID-19 and the protests connected to Black Lives Matter, the U.S. doesn't have a ton of bandwidth, I think, in the administration to deal with Korea right now. So it would seem like a good moment for North Korea to try and test and see what the South Koreans are willing to do. That said, I'm not sure that, this is the way to go about that. Um, in general, I guess when it comes to the U.S. and North Korea, there are kind of overlapping solipsisms maybe at play, where the U.S. we tend to think everything's about us, and in North Korea they tend to think everything is about them. Um, and overall, in North Korea, political and policy decisions they start at the local and expand outward. So they have to think the most about what's going on internally, and then after that, China, South Korea, and then the U.S. probably.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that what's going on right now is connected to the U.S. directly, although obviously, given that sanctions are the current main fetter on inter-Korean cooperation, um, it's connected through the I think the mutual desire in both Seoul and Pyongyang to go beyond the sanctions regime in some way. That desire is obviously more intense in the north than in the south.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. is very much involved in creating the structural conditions that prevent further inter-Korean cooperation, but probably not directly involved in creating the proximal conditions for the current bout of tensions that we're seeing. So we
Yeah.
are running a little short on time, but I wanted to also get your thoughts on what really can South Korea do from here. I thought your remarks, by the way, on the leaflet drops were right on. I mean, it kind of looked like the North Koreans said jump, and they didn't expect the South Koreans to jump. But then the South Koreans
Yeah.
not only jumped, but
Yeah.
they began doing jumping jacks, and
Yeah.
it sort of caught them off guard. But the point is, I mean, what can the South Korean side do? I mean, they tried to play ball, but the North Korean playbook, if it exists, is rolling forward, and they have their mindset on provocation. So, is there even something Seoul can do realistically?
Yeah, I mean, Seoul's in a difficult position now and has been ever since the collapse of the Hanoi summit. I think Moon Jae-in was kind of a diplomatic genius, foreign policy wizard during his first year and a half, where first he navigated the THAAD crisis, and then these tensions heaped upon Seoul by North Korea's missile and nuclear tests in 2017, and then Fire and Fury and all that from the U.S. side. I thought he did a tremendous job of staying relevant to all sides, building up this political capital, and then spending it to help get the US and North Korea to the table, first in Singapore, but then especially in Hanoi. And then when that collapsed, that political capital collapsed with it. And now he doesn't really have much he can offer or leverage in either Washington or Pyongyang. So I feel bad for them here. Really, they're kind of at the mercy of these two, mercurial governance systems, and I wonder actually in the past week, because of how quickly they moved on the leaflets, if perhaps one of two things might be at play. Maybe they have like a soft agreement with the North Koreans to do something, and something that would be politically popular here, whether it's reunions or some other cooperative project that they don't want to give the North Koreans a pretext to pull out of. That's one possibility. Other possibility is that maybe they had some intelligence that the North Koreans were moving towards a provocation, something kinetic, to use that risible phrase again, and they were trying to cut it off before the North Koreans allowed their process of tension building to develop. So those are a couple of possibilities right now. Overall, though, as I mentioned, they're really stuck between Washington and Pyongyang, who don't seem to have anything new to say to one another to create the conditions that would allow inter-Korean projects to take place.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, listening to you talk and like reflecting on the 20th anniversary of the first inter-Korean summit, I mean, one of the tragedies of this triangle has always been the relative lack of Seoul the relative lack of agreement in Seoul and Washington on a strategic level about how best to treat North Korea, right? I mean, progressives in Seoul have often felt very lonely. And I think that's very much been the case with Moon Jae-in and Trump. I mean, more so than ever, really. And so that's really the tragedy here at the end of the day, is that there's all this will on the Korean peninsula, and there's all this interest in self-determining the future of the peninsula, but structural conditions make that impossible.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, peace building in any context where there's multiple interests and groups involved, it takes a bit of luck, right? It takes the alignment of particular individuals who are willing to take risks. And it seemed for a minute maybe that we had the right three people working at the same time in Trump, Moon, and Kim. So that was frustrating to see the contours of what a deal that would change the dynamic on the peninsula might look like for me, and then see it slip away. And now, you have to wonder if the next opportunity is going to be several years away, because I think the collapse of Hanoi really, for Kim Jong-un, most of all, falsified the process of engagement in the eyes of his key stakeholders. So he went back from Hanoi and basically, I think, has been unable to sell the idea of talking to or trying to cooperate with the Americans or the South Koreans. So I think it'll be some time before that idea is able to gain traction again in Pyongyang.
Right. Well,
it's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is very unfortunate. Absolutely. Andre, I really want to thank you for taking the time to come talk about some of these things today. I think it was a really helpful distillation of some of the context in which we can understand what's happening right now on the peninsula. So really, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. This was very, very enjoyable.
My pleasure. For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.